It's midsummer 1940. Britain faces a battle to survival against Hitler's Germany.
Prime Minister Winston Churchill hopes that this will be the Empire's finest hour.
But Churchill himself must confront horrible dilemmas.
Stay with us for the story of momentous decisions and dramatic military operations here on Churchill, the finest half hour.
Hello, I'm Professor Richard Toye, and with me is my good friend and co-conspirator, Dr. Dockter. Over the next two episodes of Churchill, the finest half hour, we're going to look at just what Churchill achieved in the summer of 1940 in terms of some major decisions and the leadership he displayed.
And we're going to look at how Churchill explained those decisions and expressed what his leadership was about in a couple of speeches, which at the time were really significant. But one of the reasons they're particularly interesting today is that they may just be the greatest Churchill speeches you've never heard of.
Right. And so in the sort of immediate aftermath of the French having decided to quit the war, famous phrase that the Battle of France is over, the Battle of Britain is about to begin. We're not going to talk so much about the Battle of Britain itself in this episode, but we're going to talk about the consequences of the French armistice and what Churchill had to do next, or decided to do next, along with his colleagues. And at this point, there was a really difficult decision for him to make. He acknowledged in his memoirs it was one of the most unnatural and painful decisions that he'd ever made. The French having abandoned the fight, the question of what would happen to the French fleet.
Right, and I think that raises a couple questions, because obviously France had a significant naval presence. The French fleet was a serious powerhouse still, and Churchill immediately understood the threat that if the Germans, who we must remember didn't really have any kind of naval presence as a result of the First World War, apart from things that they started building, so they're quite late to the party, whereas the French fleet had been built up and that it was a very strong, serious thing. And is it worth pointing out that the French fleet is also under command of Admiral Darlan? I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but he's kind of a loose cannon. That's maybe not the best way to put it, but he's certainly a narcissist. And at several instances prior to this, had promised that the French fleet would not fall into the German hands. But of course, just his word isn't going to work for an international sort of agreement of cooperation against the Germans, particularly while the French are still trying to fill the Germans out on a kind of potential terms might be. Churchill immediately, I think, understood that the second that Marshal Pétain had signed this kind of armistice, that of course the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, would effectively want control of their fleet.
And so the German-French armistice was signed on 22nd of June, and it is obviously, from the French point of view and from the British one, a very terrible thing. And it's just worth going over some of the specific articles in this agreement obviously at the sort of point of a gun. And Article 8 required French warships to be collected in ports to be specified and they're demobilized and under German or Italian control.
Which is interesting, right? So that in Article 8 it does specify this, but Germany was publicly saying, or at least internationally saying, that it had no intention of using the French fleet at all. But of course, Churchill, his position was always that you couldn't trust the Germans, particularly the Nazis. And he described that German assurances were worth less than an oat.
I mean, probably fair comment, really. But suppose, what is worrying for the British is this strength which you've just mentioned that the French had could not only lost to Britain, but could potentially be turned against the British. So Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound, for example, describes the battleship as the most powerful battleship afloat in the world today. And Churchill's fear, obviously, is that if this falls into the hands of the Germans, it could pose a mortal danger, which in his words could potentially alter the whole course of the war.
For Cardinal Richelieu, arch villain in the Alexandre Dumas novels, the Three Musketeers and so forth.
So this then really is a problem, because it's probably clear that Churchill would have much preferred it if the French had sailed the fleet to British ports, or even had, scuttled the ships themselves. Right. And so he also kind of faces a bit of a dilemma, because although Britain obviously has not itself been defeated, there is a very serious question about what military action it can actually take. The British people wanted to see the British Army being on the front foot to taking the initiative, and not only the Army, of course, the armed forces in general. And so he also kind of faces a bit of a dilemma, because although Britain obviously has not itself been defeated, there is a very serious question about what military action it can actually take. Actually, having the British launch an attack on it, it was a very obviously awkward thing to do, where just really kind of a matter of days before these two countries have been on the same side, and then just consider what's now starts being talked about, which is to potentially launch an attack which is aimed to put the fleet or significant parts of it out of action.
Well, and I also just want to underscore this, that we talked about the character of Admiral Darlan, who was the supreme commander of the French fleet at the time. And he, again, was a very ambitious, egocentric type person. And of course, there were communications going back and forth between Britain and him, and he had assurances. And so this is happening at the high level, but then actually on the ground at Mers-el-Kebir, which is in North Africa, basically the British fleet is there and the French fleet is there, and there are reports that like the soldiers are all waving to each other. I mean, they greet each other as friends. And then this ultimatum is sent forth from Admiral Somerville, who's the commanding officer there of what was called Force H, as a part of Operation Catapult, which is this whole operation. And he presented Admiral Gensoul with the ultimatum that effectively said that the French need to present themselves to the Royal Navy and sail away to a British port and accept demilitarization, because Britain, rightfully so, understood the Nazi regime as an existential threat and required that the French see it that way as well.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think it's worth making the effort to try to see this from the French perspective as well. From their point of view, the armistice was binding on them, and that therefore, if they had orders to not give over the fleet to the British, then they had to legally stick by those orders as far as they were concerned. Those people were obviously, it should be acknowledged, very difficult and uncomfortable and ultimately dangerous, life-threatening position, as it turned out. I think what you've got is a kind of obviously radically different interpretations of the circumstances of the armistice going on between the British and the French. So the alternative perspective from the British is that the French were only released from their obligation not to seek a separate peace, sort of on condition that they then sailed the French fleet away. So that this was the argument that the French had kind of breached their agreement. So I mean, we're basically setting up the scene for kind of mutual recriminations between the two countries.
That's right. And so if we zoom in on the actual kind of moment, if you've ever read or if you've ever looked at, maybe you've seen these, Richards, the actual wire communiques that are going through. So Churchill trying to send communications to Darlan, he's sending communications to Admiral Somerville and communications Soul, and there's this like cacophony of wire things, because I think everyone's like, hey, this is something that we can defuse. It's like a bomb's about to go off. But Admiral Darlan refused to back down, and so obviously Admiral Gensoul had to accept that position and basically decided to maintain his obligations. And once it became clear to Churchill that there was no way that the French were going to accept the position that Britain had presented, he sent a coded communique to Admiral Somerville, and it's 3 words, and I've always found this kind of chilling. What he wrote was, "Settle matters quickly." And immediately they opened fire, and within 10 minutes they had done irreparable damage to the French fleet.
Yeah, this action at Mers-el-Kebir, horrendous really. There was, as you say, a kind of a 10-minute engagement. The battleship Britannia was sunk. The battlecruiser Dunkirk was badly damaged and ran aground. And in total, there were 1,297 French sailors who were killed. There were some other ships. There was a battle cruiser called Strasbourg, and some other ships which managed to escape as well. This episode was filmed, and the Vichy French propaganda, the new kind of collaborationist regime, absolutely maximized the footage over the subsequent years to portray what was perceived as British perfidy.
And it was also used, of course, in German propaganda to try to illustrate the case that the French couldn't trust the British.
Well, the Germans, of course, would really take it sort of anything as an opportunity to spread propaganda. And they're not actually necessarily that good at propaganda, it has to be said. I mean, people always kind of talk as Goebbels as this propaganda genius. But at the initial point where the Germans have sort of occupied a big part of France, then the initial new propaganda newsreels that are being put out are with voiceovers by people who can't really speak French properly, or at least with a kind of heavy German accent, which kind of goes down like a lead balloon. And the propaganda efforts are subsequently refined, but including by the Vichy regime itself, who in some ways are quite skilled at their propaganda, and crucially trying to make it appear authentically French.
Right. I think it's worth pausing to note here. Those of you that have read Hannah Arendt will know this, that the goal of propaganda, isn't necessarily to change someone's opinion. It's to muddle the truth so that you don't understand what the truth actually is. And so, I think that the French propagandists were very good at that. I would argue that the German propagandists were good at putting stuff out that was just like, oh, wow, some crazy's coming out of Germany. Okay. So it's almost like, well, we don't know what's real, so we can't believe anything. But of course, as you can imagine, I mean, if you were French, again, if you put yourself in French shoes, and I'm supposing they're Cartier.
Cartier shoes?
I don't know. I don't
Okay.
know a lot about clothes, Richard. What I do know is that the French public was absolutely outraged, and rightfully so. So even years later, I mean, there's still a black mark here that has never gone away over what was done. You would see this in French newspapers. They claim that it was the vilest, most repugnant act of aggression ever committed.
Absolutely. And this is something which is always going to divide British and French opinion. From the British perspective, this was so sorry, we're very regretful about this, but we kind of had to do it. An understandable perspective. Actually, there was, at least after the war, there was some post-war criticism of the action, even within Britain, it has to be said. And
Yes.
Lord Hankey, who had been cabinet secretary, he'd then actually been in the war cabinet briefly in 1939 to 40, became eventually sort of got kicked out of the government, and was, maybe you could argue, he was a rather sort of disgruntled character. But after the war, he's saying, well, what if Churchill or his colleagues were put on trial for, aggressive war as the Nazis had been at Nuremberg, how would this look in that context? And was there a actual just casus belli for attacking another country's fleet when that country had obviously not attacked Britain? This is a debatable bit, I suppose, whether or not the ships formed some kind of imminent threat to Britain. So at the time, though, I should say, within Britain, there weren't any dissenting voices, and this was something that was accepted as necessary.
Yeah, well, and I think there's also an interesting collateral gain that happens out of this, in that President Roosevelt in the United States, I think it's understood strategically among Roosevelt and Roosevelt's people in the cabinet that Churchill is a serious man, and that they understood the strategic decision. And so increasingly from the American perspective, it's not only Churchill's our horse that we need to back, but also, he's going to need help. And it allows, I think, kind of the backroom dealings of the Roosevelt administration to start laying the groundwork for increased aid to the UK.
That sounds like a good point to take a break. And when we come back, we'll look at how Churchill explained and justified the decision to attack the French fleet to Parliament and to the British public.
Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour, with me, Dr. Warren Doctor, and my friend, Professor Richard Toye. And we've been discussing a significant moment in early July 1940, when Winston Churchill ordered the Royal Navy to attack the French fleet in North Africa.
And so it's kind of then worth moving on to how Churchill handled the comms, as we would now say. So remember, of course, that there was radio, there was the telegraph, which could communicate news pretty quickly, but you didn't have 24-hour rolling news. And so that Churchill making a statement in the House of Commons, which is what he did on July the 4th, was in fact a key way in which the British received information, detailed information about what had happened. And so they got both information and an explanation from Churchill all in one package. But you could say that had the communications been handled differently or handled poorly, then there could have been more dissent or things could have gone quite a different way.
One of the interesting transitions here is until Churchill makes the speech that we're about to talk about, it's almost like, which way is this going to go? Because as we've said several times, Churchill's an enormous Francophile. And he even says in his memoirs that was such a hateful thing that he did. It's debatable if he ever forgave himself for it. I don't know. But I just think it's an interesting transition to full military action. And then we see him needing to kind of create the kind of political, rhetorical scaffolding to support the action which he has done.
Right. And it's got to be remembered as well that there's a domestic political angle to this too. Churchill is Prime Minister, but he is not leader of the Conservative Party. And the guy who is still the leader of the Conservative Party is Neville Chamberlain, who's still in his cabinet as Lord President of the Council and remains a very powerful figure who is much loved by many Conservative MPs. And so up until this point, I think we've mentioned this before, that often the Labour MPs in the House of Commons are giving a kind of demonstratively a warmer reaction to Churchill when he speaks than the Conservative MPs, who appear to have been kind of sitting on their hands slightly. And we'll talk about the speech, but it's just worth noting that Chamberlain received a letter from a journalist saying, look, this doesn't look very good. It's kind of making everybody look bad to not have the Conservative Party giving the full support, vocal support to Churchill in the Commons. But then it looks like Chamberlain had taken that on board and kind of got the message out to the right people in advance of this speech. So what about the speech itself?
Well, so it's interesting, the kind of rhetorical stuff, and it's one of those speeches I would encourage anyone to go and read for themselves, because it's almost Shakespearean in the way that he frames it and uses his rhetoric in it. And just in terms of the structuring of it. So he successfully frames the attack not against France or anything to do with the hostility about France, but the fact the Bordeaux government had inflicted a mortal injury upon Britain with the full knowledge of the consequences, forcing the hand of the British government actually the French signed an agreement with the Germans, and so we had no choice but to defend ourselves. So he went to the utmost lengths to stress Britain's moral position, and he said, we are determined to fight on to the end, and if we win, and we think we shall never forget that France was our ally.
Right. So I think it's just kind of worth dwelling on that a second, just to sort of clarify that the Bordeaux government was that which had eventually, when Marshal Pétain had become head of the government, agreed to the armistice. It would subsequently move its seat to Vichy. So we talk about the Vichy regime. So at this point, Churchill is still talking about the Bordeaux government, and what he's trying to do there, as you say, is to kind of separate out what he suggests are a small kind of unrepresentative group of traitors, really, from the mass of the French people. Now, that's a kind of like a skillful maneuver from the point of view of the British, possibly from the Americans, but wasn't necessarily going to work from the point of view of the French. I mean, the French opinion was very divided, but the resistance movement had not yet got going, so that there was this body of opinion who would have seen Pétain as being the legitimate head of the government.
But of course, he's still sending an olive branch to France and to the Free French that, it's difficult that we've had to do this, and we understand how awful this is. But at the same time, if we work together against the Germans, there is still a way forward together.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the skills which Churchill has got on this occasion, in that you could say this is a less rhetorical speech than some. I'm not saying there aren't any quotable bits, really. There are plenty of perfectly good sentences in it, but there aren't any of the bits which have gone down in the dictionaries of quotations. And
Right.
maybe that, to a certain extent, is actually a conscious choice on Churchill's part, because what he's doing is trying to present things as a very sober and kind of factual relationship of distressing events, distressing but necessary.
Right. I think that it's a deliberate choice is actually very, very interesting, Richard. And I think it's just funny to me that I described it as almost Shakespearean, and you literally were like, well, it's got a couple of good sentences in it. But I mean,
Well,
the
and you
point
said
is that I couldn't quote it off the top of my head.
exactly. I mean, I
Right.
think you made a good point about the structure and the way that it tells a story, and kind of there are bits of Shakespeare that aren't necessarily quotable as well. There's
Right.
plenty of those too. So, but I think it's probably worth just saying again, why didn't anybody hear it? And this is really because, as we've mentioned in previous episode, that speeches in the House of Commons weren't recorded or broadcast at this time. Well, I was going to say, and so and furthermore, Churchill, this was not one of the speeches which Churchill, unlike the 18th of June finest hour speech, which he did, he went out and repeated that over the airwaves in the evening. He didn't do that with this one. People had to read about it in the newspaper, and I don't believe that he ever did a post-war recording when he was kind of laying down his greatest hits either. So that's why you haven't kind of got a recording of it. So it doesn't get played over and over again on documentaries, for example, which is how we're familiar with lots of those other quotations in really quite short sound bites.
Right. I completely agree with what you're saying. But what's really interesting to me about this, and of course, this is again where your book, Roar of the Lion, really shines, is because so if we focus in on you were talking about the domestic political situation. So that moment that he gives this speech in the House of Commons, it's a moment, right? It completely changes everything. Talk to us, tell our listeners at home, dear listeners, listen to my friend Richard discuss. I don't know why I'm suddenly a 19th century narrator, but what the power of this speech is in the House of Commons, and thus the domestic political sphere, I guess.
Okay, so essentially, this is key point, which is that Churchill sits down at the end of it, seeming emotionally overwhelmed with his head in his hands. There's again, no photographs in the House of Commons. So we have a kind of an illustrator's sketch of this moment of other people coming up to congratulate him while he sits there kind of deeply moved. But also at the moment where he sits down, this is the point at which the Conservative MPs stand up, they wave their order papers, they're possibly cheering, at any rate, a very overwhelming positive reaction. And so he's really pulled off a magnificent act of argument, really, the lucid presentation of a case. And in a sense, you can disagree. If you're French, you'll certainly disagree whether or not it was justified to do what had been done, but he put forward the best possible case for what the British had done. Arguably, some of that reaction was actually kind of orchestrated, because the Conservative leaders and the chief whip, the guy who instills party discipline in MPs, had realized that it was looking bad for them not to be cheering, and so there may have been a bit of encouragement there. But certainly he's got every kind of immediate reaction that he wanted there. If we turn to the public, then again, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Remember, they had, apart from people who were physically present in the House of Commons, nobody had actually heard the speech, and so they had to rely on radio news summaries, or by reading really lengthy extracts or even the full speech in the newspapers. Newspapers did reproduce speeches of very great length, particularly if they were those of the Prime Minister. So this was something which would have been widely disseminated, and people were certainly aware of it. And I think it's worth saying that as far as we can judge popular reactions from things like Ministry of Information, Home Intelligence reports, they were very, very, even more so than earlier speeches like Finest Hour or Fight on the Beaches. And I guess the interesting point here is it maybe wasn't just the reaction to the speech. It was kind of, again, a package of the speech plus what had happened. So people felt positive or buoyed up by the fact that finally the British were actually taking action somewhere. They felt on the back foot for so long.
And so I think it's important. So you can see that would kind of bolster the British feeling at home, but then of course the feeling abroad was, again, from the American perspective, you see the Roosevelt administration being like, wow, this is, they are resolute and they are going to fight on no matter what. Very clear. And I think that even in sections of America where you saw strong strands of isolationism, they even saw Britain as being, and this is the kind of Joseph P. Kennedy view of the world, that, well, like, Britain's toast. There's no way that they can come back from this.
Him, of course, got to remind listeners that he was the ambassador to the United Kingdom and was kind of quite unsympathetic to the British.
Right. In fact, Joseph P. Kennedy was not fervently anti-Churchill, but not far from that. So there was this very strong American view in certain quarters that were just like, well, the British are done for, and there's no. But even they took note, and you can see this in American press reports at the time, that it was very clear that Britain wasn't going down without a fight, and it was very serious. Which I also, that must have been very difficult news for the Germans as well, to see like, well, we're in for a real fight now. So it changed in many ways, I think, the entire geopolitical conversation. Churchill's resoluteness in his speech, his full support at home. I mean, suddenly you can see that now Britain is becoming a fortress, and it's a good thing it's becoming a fortress, because obviously the German high command is looking at an imminent invasion.
Yeah, of course, this is a key point. The official start date of the Battle of Britain was 10th of July, 1940, so after the events that we've just been discussing with the destruction of the French fleet. However, there were already air battles going on, and one of the things which is being discussed in the newspapers at the same time as the destruction of the French fleet is a famous occasion where a radio commentator is watching a dogfight in the skies above southern England and giving this kind of excitable commentary as though he's talking about a sporting event, talking about a German pilot being shot down. Now, this is actually quite controversial in contrast to sort of the events with the French fleet, because there are quite a lot of people writing in the newspapers saying, well, this is really tasteless to treat war as though it is sport. And they're also saying, well, apart from anything else, it's giving people encouragement to do what officially they're not supposed to do, which is to break cover, go outside and sort of stare up in the sky while there are air battles going on, which is obviously a potentially dangerous thing to do. So the air war is about to really start meeting its highest intensity, and the threat of invasion is still present. And that actually is something which Churchill very much wants to keep in the minds of the public.
So Winston Churchill has taken the painful decision to attack a former ally,
strengthening his political standing at home and abroad.
But can the Prime Minister galvanize the British people to fight as never before?
Join us next time for the answer here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.